In that lecture on coagulation cascades, we talked about complement. So factors C3A and C5A, these are factors that are going to not only be chemoattractants, but they're also going to increase vascular permeability even more. And finally, histamines secreted from your mast cells and your leukotrienes, these are going to break cell-to-cell contact in the endothelium and really allow those neutrophils and monocytes to get into the wound. So there are a lot of things that are happening. These don't happen in sequence. They're basically happening all together. But think about bradykinin, your complement C3A, C5A, as well as histamine leukotrienes as being some really important mediators to vasodilating and increasing vascular permeability so those inflammatory cells like neutrophils and monocytes can get in the wound and start to do their job. So neutrophils, you gotta love the neutrophils. So this is the most important cell in the first 24 hours of an injury in a wound. Well, why is that? Well, neutrophils are the cell that's responsible for sterilizing the wound. Neutrophils are scavengers, so they're gonna get rid of debris. They're gonna get rid of bacteria. They're even gonna get rid of foreign bodies. So they're really important in that first 24 hours for cleaning up the wound. So what happens next? Well, next, right around 48 to 72 hours, you get your monocytes, both that are coming in from the local environment and also monocytes that have been attracted from those chemoattractants like the complement factors, C3A, C5A. And they're coming in and they're gonna come into the wound and the monocytes are gonna become macrophages. And these are the primary regulator of wound healing. And they're the primary cell type or the predominant cell type at 48 to 72 hours. Now you ask yourself, or I ask myself, well, so why are these the primary regulator of wound healing? Well, the reason is because macrophages secrete a ton of growth factors. Everything from TGF beta and TGF alpha, which we're going to talk about, platelet-derived growth factor, EGF, fibroblast growth factor, VEGF, all of these are secreted by the macrophage. And so the macrophage is really responsible for elaborating these growth factors so they can get the fibroblasts into that wound and start to lay down some collagen. We're going to talk about that. So why else? So from a surgeon's point of view, what's a good example of why it's important to know that the macrophages are predominant at 48 to 72 hours? Well, if you ever have heard of something called delayed primary closure, this is an excellent relay or an excellent tie into the basic science and why you got to know the basic science of wound healing. So in delayed primary closure, let's say that you have a really sick patient who's septic. You open up their belly and you find that they have diffuse peritonitis. Maybe they have stool or fecal debris all over the abdomen. You go ahead and it's diverticulitis, so you do a sigmoid colectomy, you bring out an endostomy. It's a dirty wound, class 4 wound. And so you decide that I need to close the fascia, but I'm going to leave this wound open. Well, when's the best time to close that wound? So delayed primary closure is when you don't close the wound right at the time of surgery. You also don't let the wound heal by secondary intention. That would be if you left the wound edges open and you allow granulation tissue to fill the wound. But what you do is you do a primary closure after a few days. And the optimal timing is between 48 and 72 hours when the neutrophils have sterilized the wound, gotten rid of all the debris, and the macrophages are predominant. And we find that if you do a DPC or a delayed primary closure at 48 to 72 hours, you can have really good outcomes with decreased surgical site infections. So that's a great tie-in and why it's important to know the basic science of wound healing. All right, what's next? So next is transitioning from this inflammatory phase to the proliferative phase. And what is the marker of the proliferative phase? Well, the marker of the proliferative phase is collagen deposition in the formation of that collagen matrix, as well as fibroblast proliferation. So when we get into the proliferative phase, the fibroblast becomes the predominant cell type between days 3 and 5. And the function of the fibroblast is to lay down collagen and heal this wound. So how do fibroblasts work? So you can see here, and I got a little cartoon going, and you can go back to that lecture on primary hemostasis where we talk about laying down of that hemostatic plug or that platelet plug, and you get this matrix of fibrin and fibrinogen. Well, the fibroblasts use this when they start to migrate to the wound because of those macrophages. They use this as a scaffold to start to lay down this collagen and extracellular matrix. Now you can see that in the extracellular matrix I have here, that's composed of fibrin, fibrinogen, macrophages, platelets, and glycosaminoglycans, and the most predominant one here is hyaluronic acid, and I have it as HA. Now that is a molecule that absorbs a ton of water, so it's like a sponge, and fibroblasts can use all of these together as a scaffold for starting to lay down the collagen. Now, laying down the collagen and having fibroblasts proliferate is a really complex process. The formation of this ECM or extracellular matrix is dependent on not only the cells, not only the macrophages and the fibroblasts, but it's also dependent on integrins and membrane receptors within the extracellular matrix. So it's a complex process, but this gives you kind of a simplified version and who the major players are. So when the fibroblasts start laying down collagen, what is collagen and what are the different types? And so here, there are more than 27 types of collagen. Now they all have a right-handed triple helix. Maybe that would come useful in an exam. And all of the different types have to do with, they're differentiated by changes in that triple helix. Maybe a bend here or a bend there will be the difference between type 3 collagen and type 1 collagen. Now the reason I brought up type 3 and type 1 collagen is type 1 collagen is it's the predominant collagen in the skin, both in unwounded skin and in wounded skin. But in the early phases of wound healing, type 3 collagen is very high. A good way to think about the ratio of type 1 to type 3 collagen is that there is 4 times as much type 1 collagen as there is type 3 collagen in skin and wound scar. Now, even though there is relatively increased amount of type 3 collagen early in the healing process, it's always less than the total amount of type 1 collagen in the mature scar. So after a couple of weeks in the proliferative phase, laying down that collagen, we get into the remodeling phase. So the remodeling phase takes into action or goes into action between 2 and 3 weeks in a wound. And this is where you get further collagen cross-linking, regression of the capillaries. So that's when the wound becomes less pink, okay, because the capillaries are starting to regress. And you get maturation of the scar, which can take up to a couple of years. Now, there are a bunch of enzymes involved in this process, and they can be the collagenases or gelatinases or the matrix metalloproteinases or MMPs. Now, it's important that you don't need to remember all those, but just know that there are a lot of different enzymes responsible for that collagen cross-linking, transitioning from type 3 to type 1 collagen, and of course, regressing those capillaries and maturing the scar. And in this cartoon, you can see a progression of a wound. So you take that first wound that maybe somebody had a lac repair or that knee that we saw, you repaired that laceration, and you see that you have bruising, some ecchymosis around the wound. And then after you take the sutures out, maybe around day 7, you see that the wound is still really red. That's because maybe bradykinin or some of these other vasodilators are still within the wound bed and they're causing those capillaries to engorge. But after time, these capillaries go away, they regress during the remodeling phase, and then you could be left with this thin, pale scar. Now we can ask the question, what is scar? What's the difference between normal skin and scar? Well, scar is where you have disorganized collagen deposition and also disorganized tissue architecture compared to the skin around it. So finally, in the remodeling phase, one thing to remember, and this is frequently tested on your exams, is tensile strength. So at different stages in the wound healing process, the wound is going to gain strength. Now you can see in this graph that the increase in tensile strength is quite rapid in the first few days of a healing wound, but it's still very low as a percentage of the strength or the tensile strength in normal skin. And even after waiting 6 to 8 weeks, you see that a scar is only going to heal up to 80% of the strength of normal skin. So it will never be the same. Now this graph gives you an idea of how the tensile strength progresses over these stages of wound healing. Now in the next couple of slides, I want to go over a few of the really important growth factors that you should know. And we're going to break them down into what the growth factor is, what the cells are responsible for secreting it, and of course what the function of that growth factor is. So I'm going to get out of the way. And so on this slide, I have two growth factors. I have platelet-derived growth factor and transforming growth factor beta. So platelet-derived growth factor, or PDGF, is secreted by alpha granules in the platelets, and in addition, macrophages, endothelial cells, and fibroblasts. So what does PDGF do? It is a chemoattractant, so it attracts neutrophils, macrophages, and fibroblasts to the wound. It also stimulates fibroblasts to synthesize new extracellular matrix. It also increases the collagenase enzyme, which we just learned is responsible or is active in the remodeling process. So how about TGF-beta, or transforming growth factor beta? So this is secreted by platelets, macrophages, fibroblasts, and keratinocytes. You can see that there's a pattern here with platelets, fibroblasts, and macrophages being really important in the wound healing process. And what does TGF-beta do? It stimulates collagen synthesis and decreased extracellular matrix degradation. It also attracts fibroblasts and macrophages to the wound. So it's kind of this self-fulfilling prophecy. You get TGF-beta that's secreted by macrophages and fibroblasts, and that attracts more macrophages and fibroblasts into the wound. And we've learned that in the inflammatory phase, once the neutrophils are done cleaning up the wound, the macrophages are the predominant cell type. And then of course, when we get into the proliferative phase, the fibroblasts take over and start laying down that collagen. So let's go to a couple more growth factors, just two left. So fibroblast growth factor, that's another important one. This is secreted by endothelial cells, fibroblasts, and macrophages. And this stimulates endothelial cells to divide and form new capillaries. Wounds need blood to heal. And this is also why wounds are a little bit red or pink. And so FGF stimulates the formation of these new capillaries. And another growth factor really responsible for this angiogenesis or formation of blood vessels is called VEGF, or vascular endothelial growth factor. This is secreted by platelets, macrophages, fibroblasts, and keratinocytes, and this leads to increased expression in hypoxia. And also stimulates the proliferation of endothelial cells for angiogenesis. So another really important growth factor, and both of these are involved in increasing the blood supply to get that wound healed. All right, just to recap, we got wound healing. We have three phases: inflammatory,